Welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going back to a classic, Jane Eyre, but we're taking a little bit of a different approach this time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We got some really interesting excerpts from you guys this time. Excerpts from a Webster's Thesaurus edition of Jane Eyre.
The source edition.
Yeah, one of those where it sort of gives synonyms for different words in the book, and I thought this was a really interesting opportunity.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. So kind of our mission today is to look at these thesaurus entries and see if we can maybe uncover any new meanings or any insights into characters that maybe even those of us who have read Jane Eyre a bunch of times might not have thought about before.
I love that.
Yeah, so let's jump right in. So, one of the first things that struck me in chapter 2, when Jane is a Gateshead, there is a thesaurus entry for strengthened.
Uh-huh.
And one of the synonyms that they give is rebel slave, which I thought was so interesting.
Yeah, really kind of shifts your perspective on her defiance a little bit, right? Makes it seem like it's not just about her, rebelling against her aunt or John Reed, but it's like a deeper struggle for freedom.
It really does. It suggests that there's something really, really deeply ingrained in this kind of power dynamic that's trying to crush her spirit, not just control her behavior.
I agree. I agree.
And this idea of being trapped, and not just physically, but emotionally, kind of resonates throughout the whole book. And we see it again in the Red Room scene, where the thesaurus gives us words like riveted, secure, forsake.
Yes.
But, I was also really struck by the entry for cold. Because it seems to go beyond just like the physical chill of the room. And it's almost foreshadowing this kind of like emotional coldness that Jane encounters, over and over again throughout her life.
Right, right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it becomes this sort of like a metaphor for all the ways in which she feels stifled and isolated.
Yeah.
And, even when you think about it, it ties into like her fear of the supernatural later because the entries, preternatural and consolatory, come up in relation to that. And it really makes you think about how that Red Room experience kind of colors her whole worldview.
It's not just like a scary childhood memory. It's like it really does set the stage for her and how she sees the world and the challenges that she has to kind of overcome.
Yeah, and how she reacts to them, her resilience.
Absolutely. And speaking of kind of impactful characters, let's move on to Mr. Brocklehurst.
Okay.
Because, the thesaurus entry for obese is just so pointed to me, especially when you think about it in conjunction with, the words that they use to describe him, kind of like scorn towards the girls.
Bronte's not being subtle there, is she?
No, she's not. She's not subtle at all. So, I mean, what do you make of that kind of juxtaposition and, thinking about how that might affect young Jane's perception of piety and religion and all of that?
Well, it seems like she sees right through him, doesn't she? She recognizes that true goodness isn't about like outward appearances or these rigid rules.
Yeah.
And that's where I think someone like Helen Burns becomes so crucial.
Helen's sweetness. And that is literally one of the words that the thesaurus gives us is a direct contrast to, Brocklehurst's kind of harshness.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting to me, too, that same sweetness gets highlighted when they talk about Miss Temple, who is another really positive influence on Jane.
Right. It's like there's this pattern of genuine goodness,
Mm-hmm.
and these women kind of become role models for Jane in a way that, Mr. Brocklehurst obviously never could.
Yeah, it shows just how impactful, that Helen's friendship really is and how it shapes Jane's values.
Absolutely. Sets her on a different course.
And that kind of brings us to Mr. Rochester because, when you look at the entry stupefied, which is used to describe Jane's reaction when she first meets him.
Right after his fall.
After his fall, yeah. I mean, it captures that feeling of just being completely like, whoa.
It's interesting is it's so different than how he's described before that. He comes across as frigid, rigidly aloof, and then bam, this intense impact.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to that kind of like immediate, almost like magnetic pull that he seems to have on her despite his initial coldness.
It's not just curiosity. It's like she's completely thrown off balance.
Yeah, totally. It's like, it's almost foreshadowing that, there's going to be a lot of complications.
Oh, absolutely.
But then, as their connection kind of deepens, we see Jane's inner turmoil really kind of come to the surface. And I was so struck by the entry overflow when she's talking about her feelings for Rochester, because it's followed by this whole list of like really harsh self-criticism, like fool, idiot, dupe.
Oof, yeah.
I mean, it's painful to read.
It is. It's like you can feel her struggle.
She's
caught between these powerful feelings and then, the societal expectations that are crushing her.
Yeah, she's questioning her own worthiness. And it's a timeless thing, right? Like, how do you reconcile what you want with what you think you're allowed to have?
especially for women in that era. It's a huge theme throughout the book.
Yeah. And it makes Rochester's confession, even more kind of poignant.
Absolutely.
And the entries bind and fiery are just perfect for that moment because it's not just, I love you. It's this really intense, desperate kind of feeling.
Almost like he's losing control.
Yeah, there's definitely a foreshadowing there when you consider what happens with Bertha Mason later. But before we get there, I want to talk about how the atmosphere at Thornfield starts to shift,
Oh, yeah, it gets creepy.
Yeah, it gets creepy. And the word disquietude is just the perfect word for that kind of unsettled feeling, right? It's like a warning.
Almost like a premonition.
Yeah. And then it escalates to perilous, when she finds out about Bertha.
Right, because everything changes in that moment.
Yeah. And the way Brontë uses language to build that tension is just masterful, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
She's leading us along on this journey with Jane.
So then we come to this moment where Jane makes this really agonizing decision to leave Rochester. And the Thesaurus entry intention is so revealing because it shows that it's not impulsive, it's deliberate. It's heartbreaking, but she's making a choice.
And a huge one.
Yeah. And then they use the word curse to describe the situation at Thornfield. And it's just like that juxtaposition is just so powerful. It's like she loves him, but she can't stay.
Right, because it would be a betrayal of herself.
Yeah. And it's such a testament to her strength of character. I mean, she's choosing her own sense of worth over this love. And it's such a powerful moment.
And that's what makes Jane such an enduring character, right? It's that strength and that refusal to compromise her values.
Absolutely.
Really is, it really shows that she's putting herself first. And it's not about punishing Rochester or anything. It's about her own needs.
Yeah. And even when she's away, the Thesaurus entry, long suffering, I mean, it doesn't paint her as this victim,
Right.
She is going through it, but she's so resilient.
She's tough.
Yeah, she's tough. And she's not wallowing in self-pity. She's out there trying to build a new life.
Yeah, she's taking charge, which I think goes back to that whole idea of her independent spirit we saw at Gateshead.
Yeah, totally. And it makes her eventual return to Rochester, I think, even more powerful.
Oh, definitely.
Because she's not coming back because she's desperate. She's coming back because she's like, I'm good now.
She's made her own way.
Yeah. And Rochester has changed too by then, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's been through a lot too.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because they use that word long suffering to describe him as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's like they both had this period of, real pain and growth.
It's almost like he had to go through that to, be worthy of her in a way.
Right, to face his own demons,
Yeah. So it's not just this romantic reunion. It's like two people who have really been transformed by their experiences coming back together.
And you see that reflected in the language, too.
Yeah.
That word refreshed,
Mm.
when they talk about their relationship, it's like, it's been renewed.
It's a new start.
Yeah, it's built on something different now.
And I love how, the Thesaurus entries that were used to describe Rochester earlier, like imperious and dictatorial, they're totally gone now.
Yeah, you don't see that anymore.
And instead you have devoted and cherished.
It shows you how much he's changed.
Yeah, and how their whole dynamic has shifted.
And ultimately it leads to that, crucial moment of acknowledgement at the end.
Yes. When he finally sees her as an equal.
Right, not this possession, but a true partner.
And that's what allows Jane to truly embrace her own happiness.
Because she's not settling.
No. She's found someone who sees her for who she really is.
It's so satisfying.
It is. And it's amazing to me how, these thesaurus entries, which could have been just this, kind of dry exercise, they actually bring so much more depth to the story.
Oh, absolutely. Like this whole other layer.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, for someone who's reading Jane Eyre for the first time, do you think this approach would change their experience?
I think it would, in a good way.
Yeah.
Imagine encountering stupefied the first time you meet Rochester. It adds this whole other level of mystery.
Yeah, and realizing that even a word like obese, isn't just thrown in there. It has a purpose.
It makes you pay attention.
It really does. It's like a treasure hunt almost.
And it makes it so much more immersive.
Yeah, you're not just reading passively. You're really thinking about it.
You're part of the process.
Exactly. And that makes it so much more rewarding, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's about experiencing the text on a deeper level.
So I'm going to say to our listeners out there, grab your copy of Jane Eyre, grab a thesaurus, and give this a try.
See what you discover.
Yeah, see what jumps out at you. It's like you can almost see the blueprints, It just makes you want to go back and reread everything with this new lens.
And not just classics either. Imagine doing this with a contemporary novel and seeing how the word choices reflect what the author's trying to do.
I know, right? Like, this is blowing my mind. But okay, for our listener, who's been with us on this whole journey through the Thesaurus and Jane Eyre, what do you think is like the most important thing they can take away from this approach?
Well, I think more than anything, it encourages you to see Jane Eyre, not just as this story that we all love, but as a real work of art.
Yeah.
Like every single word is there for a reason.
It's so deliberate.
It is. And it makes you realize that there's so much more going on than just the plot. You know, it's about social commentary, it's about morality, it's about all these really complex human emotions.
And it makes you realize that even with a book that you think, like inside and out, there are always these new layers that you can uncover.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so much fun. It's not about finding the one right answer. It's about asking questions and exploring different perspectives.
So to our listener out there, I would say, pick up your copy of Jane Eyre, maybe grab a thesaurus and just have fun with it.
Yeah, play around with the language, see what you notice.
Yeah. Pay attention to the little things,
Hmm.
the word choices, the echoes of meaning. It's really fascinating.
And think about how it changes how you see Jane's journey.
It's been such a pleasure diving deep into this with you. It just goes to show that even the most familiar stories can still surprise us when we approach them with fresh eyes.
And a thesaurus.
And a thesaurus. So until next time, happy reading, everyone.